Thank you for joining us, Edwidge, to answer a few questions. I'd like to begin with your new collection of stories, Everything Inside. You drew some parallels yesterday between Children of the Sea, a story in your first collection, Cric-Crac, and Without Inspection, your most recently published story. It seems like many of the characters from this collection are literary descendants of your previous works, especially Cric-Crac. And I'm wondering if you would agree with that, and do you think of your characters as manifesting themselves in different forms or developing into new characters across your writing?
Um, yes, I think for everything inside, when the stories were finally put together, I started. I mean, it naturally got me thinking about why I began with stories, and I felt generationally like as though the characters and everything inside could be the children or the grandchildren of the ones in Creek Crack. At least they were, but the most connected of the stories I thought was were Children of the Sea, which begins at Creek Crack, and everything without inspection, which closes everything inside. And I wanted to explore to the ways that that kind of migration, the notion of boat people, and there's a great, Felix Mosello poem contesting that,
Mm.
they call us boat people. He says in the poem, and there's lists of ways that there've been boat people throughout history, right? Like, wasn't Christopher Columbus a boat person, But instead of the kind of boat person, that the way that we're portrayed, these other types of boat people who come and, and came and took everything. And then the way that whole notion of using who a boat person is these days, there's like the people who are crossing the Mediterranean, to go to Europe. And we're seeing different manifestations of that in ways that for me echoed like the 80s when people were coming by boat to Miami and the bodies on the shore, and we have that child, who stirred the world like with the little corpse on the side of the side of the ocean. So just also, without inspection was a way of updating that kind of migration and sort of talking about characters who are doing it differently now, who are on speedboats rather than these big overcrowded rafts that we've been seeing, who are smuggled in different ways. So Arnold and the young man who was in the boat in Creek Crack are somewhat related spiritually in that, but it's just traveling through time, so like the latest manifestation for us of what that migration is like. And so the stories are all, I mean, they're not updates, they're very independent stories, but it was exciting for me to think of what generationally, like, what being Haitian in a contemporary setting would be like now, as opposed to the 90s when Crack was written and published.
Could you talk about the process of bringing these stories together and their organization in the book too? Why did you return to these particular stories and organize them in the way that you did?
Yeah. Well, I liked, for example, the idea of having these stories were a lot longer than the stories in Kikak, for example, and they were mulled over a number of years, and even after they were published, I went back to them. But I liked the idea of having an even number of stories, having 8 stories, and because I felt like it was sort of balanced, and like 4 and 4 was like a good way. Most story collections sometimes have 9, sometimes have 10, but I like the idea of like really having 8 long stories. And I felt like thematically those stories, and often when a writer is putting together a story collection, you put out every story you have. Like, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to put stories that felt connected by themes, and one theme certainly love, right? Love of family, love of country. It's not always love that turns out well, but there's love playing out throughout all the stories, and then this notion of rituals that carry through the different stories. For example, with and the gift, and in the old days, and this idea of people trying to carry over rituals from the past that they were trying that through migration, and just like how do we mourn, like that was also a thing in an issue in Cook. Like, how do you mourn your dead when you don't have your elders to guide you in that process? How do you work with the few shreds of memory that you have? And I think that's the whole African diaspora experience of thinking like, what do we do with the pieces that we have left of how we mourned, how we got married, how we, so in stories like The Funeral Singer, in The Dewbreaker, for example, where this woman is, it's like that, we just work with the shred of ritual that we have, that we're passing on. So that I felt like was a theme that carried through that, all of the stories and everything inside as well.
The title of the collection, Everything Inside, appears in the first story, Dosis, and but also seems to resonate in different ways throughout the collection. Like you were saying, there's several themes that kind of tie these things together. How did you arrive at that title?
Yeah, so I live in Little Haiti, in a very gentrifying part of Little Haiti, which it's actually no longer even called Little Haiti, but when I moved there, it was part of Little Haiti. And one day I was walking through my neighborhood, and one of my newer neighbors had a sign in the window that said, "Nothing inside is worth dying for." And then I was, I kind of stopped. I was like, I didn't quite understand what that meant. And then I realized there's a bullseye in the middle of the sign, and I was like, oh, it's like no trespassing. It's that kind of sign. And we're in a state, in Florida, where someone can rightfully shoot you if you wander into their house by mistake, or that whole thing of having to protect your castle. This whole thing with the castle doctrine in the state can be deadly for trespassers. And so I remember looking at that and felt like, whoa. And it just started me thinking, and then I thought, well, it sort of seemed to me, as a person who worked with words, that's really not the most efficient way to communicate with a criminal, because it's wordy and it's long, and I thought, but like nothing inside is worth dying for, that means nothing inside is valuable, but you're talking about the value of something, and then. So I thought, oh, it should be, like my editor was like, it should be everything inside is worth dying for, and then I thought I want to put that in a story, like it was, and then I did put it in that story, and it gave me also using that title, and it was the original title of the book was Everything Inside is Worth Dying For, but that's really long too, so then it was just called Everything Inside, but it gave me an opportunity to avoid this thing. Often in story collections, the strongest story, or the story that feels like it's thematically resonates with the other stories, is the title story. And I really did not want a title story for this book, because I really wanted every story to have equal weight. So that, with just pulling that line from, those two words from that story, gave me an opportunity to also avoid having a title story.
Yeah, it's really interesting how the way Elsie in that story recalibrates that message towards the end, and really how it ties the whole story together too. So do you have a favorite story in the collection? And if so, which one is it and why?
Well, I have two favorites, and they're the two towards the end. And I think they're also favorites because they're the most recent, because they're sort of represent sort of the direction that I want to go in. So every 7 stories, I felt also, and I love that idea to sort of circle back to certain things. I have a story in the Dewbreaker called 7, and I thought, oh, this is another opportunity to go back to 7. But 7 stories came out of a novel that I was writing. I was going to write a novel that was going to be about an unnamed island, but that was like Grenada after the revolution, after Maurice Bishop and the invasion and all of that. And so, but it was going to be sort of this Caribbean island with young people. It was like that represents sort of the most idealistic view of like what the Caribbean, like a pan-Caribbean place and all that stuff. And I was working on this for quite a long time. And then I just realized that I just so enjoyed the company of these people. And then they were just kind of like, and then they became like part of like the world elite. They were just having too good a time. And I was like, I felt like sort of this note taker that was just going around behind these people having a fabulous life. That's sort of the story had become. And then and stuff. Oh, I just not like going anywhere, but I just like being in this space. And so then I sort of shrunk it to a novella, and then it just was shrunken into the story. But then um, I had this experience when I was young in Brooklyn, where we lived in this building, in an apartment building, and then one day there were these blind Haitian brothers, les frères parents, who were singers and now became or politicians in Haiti. One was in the Senate, and Lady Parent, her was mayor of Pétionville. So during the dictatorship, they suddenly moved across the hall from us, and they were getting all these and there was always so much traffic going through back in inside. And actually, the person who would later become my boss and my friend, a decade or so later, Jonathan Demme, said he had come to see them in that apartment because they recorded part of an album together. And so, Jonathan Demme, who would become a very important person in my life, had walked across from the hallway when I lived as a teenager to visit the Frères Parents. So then that idea of connecting, this idea of people who need, in exile, this group of people who are in exile, like the family, like the mother and daughter who come to Brooklyn. And so then this sort of gel together of a productive entry into the story of someone who's like, oh, this is fascinating, like I was feeling, trailing the characters in the story, like, oh, these people are fascinating, and I just want to observe their lives. And then just to have that character who's kind of like a person like me, who is invited into that world, and it should be a familiar world because she's also from an island, but it's very different in terms of who the leaders of that are. So that story, and then Without Inspection, because it took me a long time to kind of get the rhythm because I wanted to tell that story for a very long time, but I didn't know how, and that took a long time, and sort of scaling down and trying to figure out how to write a story that takes place in 6.5 seconds.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting that you mentioned the origins of that story, 7 stories, how it was originally an idea for a novel. I was going to ask you, because so many of the stories in your other works are so kind of grounded in the location that they take place in, the place itself, and one of the characters in the story speaks with a French, English, Spanish, Dutch accent, like this whole kind of melange of colonial accents. So yeah, I was just going to ask you what led to have the story take place on an unnamed Caribbean island. I mean, were you trying to represent kind of a circum-Caribbean or an island representative of the Caribbean in that story?
Absolutely, because I've read things before, more of a tourist variety things, where it's sort of like any island could stand in for one another, and I didn't want to do that, certainly. And I had just been, when I started writing the story, I had just been to Grenada, and after the hurricanes Maria and Irma that summer, and I went there with Audre Lorde's essay in mind, where she writes about returning to Grenada, and it's such a powerful essay, to read in Grenada, and so then was in Barbados soon after that, but just to actually, for me, considering what the Caribbean as a whole would be, which I'm not familiar with the entire Caribbean certainly, but what happens when I travel, when I go into St. Thomas with my mother, to Antigua with other places, and they're an elder Haitian or Haitian, often my husband too, who's a younger Haitian man, we get to these places, we're like, oh, that could be us, if we had the right leaders, if you kind of have this thing where you transplant yourself because everything else looks the same except maybe the infrastructure, right? Like the foliage is similar, the beach and everything. And so I did want to write a story that was like an island of my own making, right? And then except for that very overt, concession to like about Marfa, that one coastal town.
Mm-hmm.
That's and Marfa is about, of course, the disaster that was enslavement and what is left. And this was one place where it's kind of a place that was much more marked by that. That's off the tourist track. That's a little more distant, and where all many of these islands have that were touched by that where enslaved people had come. Like they're places where you have more marked presence than other places that even if you don't see it, but like in memory and the stories that people tell. So I wanted it to be like a sort of island, maybe an island that people like, oh, that even Caribbean people would be like, I've never heard of that. I like that to have that, so I didn't want to peg it to a particular place. And I wanted also to be clear that obviously it was in Haiti, so to have that interplay as well as to bring in, which is something that I've encountered every island that I've been to, from Guadeloupe to other places, and the notion of Haiti ranges from like great place, they did this great revolution, and oh, poor Haiti, God, what happened, and then also the issue of migration, because before the United States, there's some islands like the Bahamas that are the first place that people will go. Haitians will go as migrants, and where they're treated so terribly. Like, for example, right now, or after Dorian, where people are being deported en masse back from the Bahamas, people who've been there for generations, Dominican Republic, where people have, so also to address that issue of like how Haitian migration is perceived in neighboring islands, which the story addresses, just like a little bit quickly, but is acknowledged nonetheless.
Yeah, there's this mutual appreciation on the part of the prime minister of the island of Haitian culture, of music. He plays the Charlie Mingus Haitian fight song, I think, right? Mm-hmm. But then there's also the politician who says, we have to stop having all these Haitians showing up on our shores.
Yeah, which is a common refrain in a lot of these places where where there's a sort of a fear of like having, especially the smaller islands, where they're like, oh, if we're not careful, we'll have more Haitians than our own people there.
Yeah. So I want to bring it back to Little Haiti. It figures prominently in a lot of your work, especially in this collection. And you've recently written in the Miami Herald about the soul of Little Haiti and the gentrification happening there. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the neighborhood and what it means to you, both personally and to your work.
Well, the first time I saw Little Haiti was, I was 20 years old. I was studying at Brown, and we came maybe a little older than 20. I was doing my MFA, so maybe 21, 22. And so there was a program at the University of Miami for Caribbean writers. And it was called the Caribbean Writers Summer Institute. And I came there. It was also my first time in Miami. And then they took us there, and I thought this was the only place in the United States that was, there was a Little Haiti. Now there's one in Brooklyn that people mention. But I thought, oh, it's so great that, and then we went to Librairie Mapou, the bookstore, which is still there, and the big drawer at the time was the books, of course, but that there was a Coasol ice cream there that everybody said you have to go for. And I remember thinking, oh, it's great that people have this place that in the United States that's designated as a Little Haiti. It was a very poor neighborhood at that time, and it was for a lot of people their first landing place, when they came from Haiti, especially at the time where a lot of people were coming by boat. So it was a very special place, but it was, so a very difficult place. And at that time, there were also the young people who were in gangs who were there and so forth. But for me, when I was moving to Miami, I thought, and I was coming from New York, and so New York, you didn't have in New York that concern about address that I realized that people in Miami have, sort of like your zip code was like a kind of marker. And, and New York is like so cool to be an artist in an edgy neighborhood. So and I sort of love the idea of living in Little Haiti, and I was used to walking, and I didn't want to. And there are not that many neighborhoods really that I saw in Miami where you could actually walk along the way before the sidewalk gives away, you know. So yeah, we moved there, and then just really enjoyed the neighborhood because our neighbors were older people who have been living there for about 20, 30 years, and were like who, when they have a good avocado harvest, would share with you, and it just became like sort of a family vibe on the block. Right? You know, when my kids were born, like my neighbors came to see them and brought them things. It was just very felt really homey. And down the block, like not too far away, was Edwidge Danticat had his studio, and really waged like a big battle to have that Little Haiti Cultural Center done there. That came up while we were living there. That that happened after that, and then there were things that also that ways that Haitians laid claim to the neighborhood with the with the Notre Dame, the church that had been there for so long. But then quickly there was like this real estate boom, and a lot of our neighbors sold actually because someone would come and offer them enough money for their house to both buy a place in Haiti and to move to like North Miami or something like that. So the gentrification started and then sort of like exploded in recent years to the point that people who had been there for years who had businesses that couldn't sustain them anymore, and it's going to get more and more so because there's a big developer down Magic City that's down the block, and so that's going to change, and also what's considered Little Haiti is shrinking as well. But there are definitely places that have held out, and that for example the center is there and remains for the moment, and I think Edouard having his studio there, Libre Mapu, and other markers, and the church certainly Notre Dame, and so there will always be I think the soul of Little Haiti will always be there, like certainly the history there, and one of the things I think for newer migrants to a place is that you want to feel like you have weaved a little bit of yourself into that community, right, and that it's not erased completely. And I think like Haitians in Little Haiti have done that. Haitians in South Miami in general have done that, and people, they've had elected officials, we've had judges, and just like now in the cultural landscape with artists and like Edouard and others, and there's Jacques Mel Art Gallery with Jude Pabaloko there, and other people who've been there. So we're Edouard I think has a permanent piece in Miami Beach, so it won't be like we were never there at all. But it is it's a lost as a more concentrated hub for the community.
I was in Miami this summer for the Creole Institute I was telling you at FIU, and I felt the same way that many parts of Miami have embraced Haitian people and culture and even the language. I was wondering, since you've lived there, if you've noticed that too, an increased interest in Haitian Creole language and in Haitian culture in general, even outside of Little Haiti, and do you think people are finally starting to engage with Haitian culture and history in ways that aren't so heavily informed by American stereotypes and racism?
Yeah, I definitely think so, and I think in part is you also have a new generation that is like Haitian Americans who are very also interested in Haiti, and they're leading that too. I mean, I used to, even when we moved there about 18 years ago, when we moved to Little Haiti, there was this place called Chez le Bébé, which is this restaurant. You walk in, and then I was always struck that people were like, people who didn't speak Creole would be like, I want some griot, I want some, like that would go. And I thought, oh, this is kind of great because Haitian food it hasn't taken off. Like there's no Haitian restaurant franchise, or it hasn't taken off in that sense, but people in in South Florida know where to find their good Haitian food, and so that I do think there's an appreciation, but I think it's because in part too because of the next generation, which culturally has expanded into other communities and has brought others in, and also them for just their appreciation of it or their consumption of it is very important as well. Miami tends to be a sort of like an insular city. It's sort of like there are these people keep to their neighborhoods, but efforts to have like in Little Haiti, Big Night in Little Haiti, that concert series brings people from all over the county to Little Haiti and to expose people to the music and I think as time goes on too, people realize the complexities of communities and they're meeting Haitian people in different settings and they're not just going by what they see on the news.
Do you think literature plays any role in that?
I hope so.
No.
I hope so, but I think it's not as quick as say like music, right?
Yeah.
Or even politics, for example. But I hope so. I think in certain settings and for example, we have the Miami Book Fair, right? And now there's the Read Caribbean, and which is a really important part of it. And those panels where you have they're panels in Creole, which had never been done before. So I think literature and culture and religion, I hope that I think all of that plays a big role in it.
Yeah, it's certainly how I got acquainted with Haitian and Creole language and meeting actual Haitians too. Could you talk a bit about the different genres that you've written in some of your larger works? I'm thinking of Claire of the Sea Light began as short stories and you then expanded them into the novel form. So I'm wondering if you approach writing within a particular genre, the short story, for example, differently than you would an essay or a memoir or a piece of nonfiction.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, so there are a few things that sometimes you want to write about that might overlap, like that could be. It's like there's a possibility for something. Like, oh, could this be a short story, or should you write it in an essay? And there are a few like that, but the way I differentiate for me is that so if it's something that feels urgent that you have to talk about now, it's best that it's an essay, obviously, because for short stories or for longer fiction, you have to create characters, you have to, that takes a little bit more time to kind of like put in people that embody the thing that you're trying to say. So it's just often a matter of timeliness and urgency. Like if it's something you need to say now, then it's more like an op-ed or an essay. Even if it's a more like leisurely things, for example, for a long time I was thinking about like how to write about trash in the Caribbean, for example. And then that whole thing of now, I mean, Haiti certainly when you go on the beach and it's like plastic and foam, it's not even, and then God forbid when it's like rained or something and it's like all over the beach and during actually Hurricane Florence there was this moment where people on the beach in North Carolina were just finding these like hair relaxer containers from the DR that had traveled like in the hurricane and then like covered the beach in North Carolina. And then I sort of like thinking back to, oh, that reminds me of that time when the people in Philadelphia decided that they wanted to dump their medical waste ash in Haiti. So then just like that took a long time too, but like to frame as an essay that I wanted to write that I ended up writing, but that required like, but that couldn't be fiction. I felt like that, and I wanted to write that as something that you could research and report on, and then weave in your own my own personal thoughts on. So it depends. It depends on the thing, but often it has to do like if if it feels more like it needs to be told straightforward and of the moment as nonfiction, and just like with the memoir, about my uncle, and then with the novels, you sort of like it takes longer, it's more leisurely, it's often more pleasurable.
Yeah, I was going to ask, are you more comfortable writing in a particular genre, or do you have a preferred genre?
I certainly prefer fiction, yeah, because it's more freeing. There's a lot more liberty in that, like making things up. It could be more fun, and just being able to manipulate the reality. And because I write fiction too, there's a rigor to the nonfiction that I feel like that has to be even more upheld. At the risk of slipping into, just like of being accused of inventing things. Like you have to be even more rigorous with the nonfiction.
So these next final two questions, are kind of related to my research on your work. And so the first one is more so about history and the role that history and official histories play in your work. So many of the stories that you've written take place during a particular historical moment, but are told from perspectives that are often omitted from traditional historical narratives or accounts. In The Dewbreaker, for example, you dealt with the legacies of the Duvalier dictatorship. And a lot of the writing on that book is around the former Makut character, but most of the book is actually narrated from the perspective of the women who were either survivors or of the dictatorship or closely related to others who were. And I was just wondering, are there other historical moments or events that you've considered addressing in this way or addressing period?
I, for a long time, thought about writing about the U.S. occupation in Haiti, especially, after reading Alexis, the occupation novel, we translated.
L'Espace des Ciments.
L'Espace des Ciments, yes. Which was translated is in the Flicker of an Island.
Mm-hmm.
After reading that, especially because I've read all the crazy marine narratives of it, but that was the first sort of novelization of it that I had read, and I thought it'd be great to write a novel about that period. And I think she also has some short stories that sort of touches on that period, one of which we have in Haiti North too. So yeah, I had thought about that period, but and maybe I think one day that I will write something about that. That's like something but it's like I go back and forth to wanting to write about that because that really fascinates me. And also in my own family story, my grandfather was a Kako, and that was a story that was told there were so many stories that were told in the family about him, and then the aftermath, which I also view through literature, through like Gouverneur de la Rosée, and the different migrations of that period, and what was that like from the day to day, and the colorism and the segregation, all the stuff that was introduced, and then weaving into like Price Mars and what he wrote, following that period, and even the U.S., with Du Bois and other people who wrote here, protesting the occupation. So yeah, it's just like this whole thing in my head that I've always thought about, like how to write about that in fiction, for example, in religion, and there's so many aspects to it. So maybe one day, that will be the novel of my older age. I just haven't figured out how to broach that yet, but that's one of the periods I would love to address in fiction.
Yeah, and it's interesting, it was just recently the 100th anniversary of Charlemagne Barat. His death.
Like this past week.
Yeah. And I mean, that's one of the stories that's kind of, at least from a Haitian perspective, one of the major stories of that time. Americans might not be familiar with who Charlemagne Barat is, but he was kind of one of the major figures. Would you see yourself writing his story, or kind of how you've done in previous works, kind of an alternative history.
Yeah, no, I would do. I think no, I wouldn't write his story
Yeah.
because, in a way, his story is so much more like there's so much mythology around that story.
Yes.
You can't touch that story. Someone will touch it, but I feel like it's like you can't touch this. But it's really fascinating too. I don't remember where I was reading. Was it, I don't know, but it was maybe it was in the Haiti. So Duke University is putting together a book called The Haiti Reader,
Mm-hmm.
and I was reading some letters between him and his mother that were amazing, and it was like every other mother, like son, send money and like take it, stop being so like stop being so political, like stop upsetting me, and they were really beautiful and phenomenal letters that in a way that I had not imagined. So the letters, I think they have because they were intercepted by the U.S. Marines who were like monitoring him. It was like a kind of earlier version of the NSC or something, but they were incredible and opened up this whole side to this side of him that I thought, oh, like he was somebody's son, and it was someone who loved him and was conflicted about what he was doing, but was also kind of proud of him. It was really, they're worth reading when that book comes out. And so that, just even that opening into like this crack in the mythology, to like the human person is fascinating. But I would be, it's like Carpentier did with the Haitian Revolution, like writing about Tinoel, like as opposed to writing about Christophe himself directly. So yeah, I would want to probably write about someone unknown, And I've been also reading. It's interesting that the White King of Lagunab, just in that every once in a while, I'll do like a deep research dive into like thinking of the story, and it was fascinating. There was, for example, these young women that these Marines were kind of like half wooing, in part to gain territory. And when they weren't like being awful and writing about the zombies, they were like writing about the women that they were like kind of like in this era of like complete segregation in the States, and they were kind of navigating this this kind of almost like a plantation situation that was in their minds, and so there's a lot of material there for sure.
So the final question. Because of a lot of the causes you've supported and the organizations you're part of, you're often considered or framed as an activist or an engaged writer. I've personally grown to read and understand your work as part of a radical writing tradition, one that imagines a world where communities grieve, heal, and work towards justice beyond the structures that create and perpetuate violence. And this type of imaginative work, I think, is so important to actually building towards a future where we no longer rely on those structures and institutions. A writer that I rely on a lot, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, says that abolition is above all a vision, right? But then writers too are also often put in this position where their work is viewed as secondary or merely complementary to on-the-ground activism and organizing, and they sometimes end up being criticized for not being more active in these movements. So I'm wondering how you, as a writer of both fiction and nonfiction, deal with reconciling these responsibilities, if that's what we want to call them, and is understanding writing as a form of action part of that.
Certainly, for me, my models of writers come from people who are also very active, and citizens, and often my earliest versions of writers are people who died for that, writers like Jacques-Stéphane Alexis who were exiled for it, writers like Marie Chauvet, and others who were either self-exiled or had to leave, right? And or others who, like Felix Maurice-Leroy, who found ways to stay and still, through the work, contribute to the, to the resistance or to other, to the improvement of society. So those are my models, and that's in part the reason I will create dangerously, was to sort of acknowledge that that's the tradition that I come from, and it's one that I admire, but also realizing the balance, right? It's not one. It's certainly not either or, but there are tensions. Like if a writer shows up, like at the protest, sometimes they're like, oh, she wanted you want attention, and then and also having to acknowledge that yes, there are people on the ground often who've been doing this work for years and who put their bodies on the line, and that's why I think a lot of writers, like people, when they if they call you an activist and actual activists, people were getting arrested all the time, and you realize, no, I'm not an activist in that sense, but but maybe I'm a witness in the way that James Baldwin talked about being a witness, and he's one of those writers who wrote and showed up too, who traveled and took notes, and I think we all can contribute our strengths to what is happening. We don't all have to do it in the same way. I was watching this recent documentary about the late Toni Morrison, The Pieces I Am, where she talks about, she said, well, I had these small children, and I knew that I couldn't be on the street, like I couldn't be at the protest, I couldn't be on the buses, but I was in this editor at Random House, and then I could publish Angela Davis, and I could contribute in that way, like I could contribute where I am. And I think that's the key, like that we all to try to do the best from where we are. And often, it's like what Camus in that essay, La Tisse Sultan, like he describes that, and to translate his essay, was translated Create Dangerously, which was the inspiration for the title of my essay. But he's sort of like, you're always going to be criticized, whether you do enough or you don't do enough, the criticism will come, right? But I think it's just important to use the best tools that we have. Like my best tool wouldn't be organizing a protest, right? It would be maybe writing about the protest, But there is, I admire very much those. But there are writers who do both, who sort of show up, who, but we all have to play to our strengths and contribute what we are best at, and that's sort of the most efficient way. And in these times too, it's very. I have in the Trump era, a lot of friends who are poets, who are writers, who would say, "Oh my gosh, but I should be doing more," and the work is not enough. We sort of doubt the fact that your home writing not being enough. But I think that's powerful in itself. If that's the best, that's the best you can contribute. To use your tools in that way, and if it's producing work that will move people, that will make them understand something better, that's what you're contributing.
All right, thank you so much, Edwidge. Merci en pile.
D'accord, merci.